Okay, good morning. Welcome, small business community. I know that you're really excited about today and the topic that we're talking about because I know that you have a lot of burning questions. We get your calls all the time, as I'm sure my guest does as well. So I want to give a great big thank you and introduce you guys to Chris Wilhelmi of Stinar, Zendejas, Burrell, and Wilhelmi here in Colorado Springs. He's a wonderful attorney. We call on him often. Smarty Pants from California, employment law and ERISA attorney. And now, you've called Colorado home with your family for quite a while now, haven't you, Chris?
That's right. It's been about 5 years or so.
Okay. So you're ingrained in the community. You're one of ours now.
That's right. I'm loving it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining me to have this important conversation. There's, you and I have talked off and on about all the questions that we constantly receive from small business employers, kind of wondering where to make these decisions. There's so much guidance depending on what you're looking at on the internet, on the news, through the different entities like OSHA and the CDC and the EEOC. So I wanted to sit down and kind of simplify this a little bit, talk about some of the most hot things that are happening right now in the small business community as far as COVID. So why don't we start out with, to go back to the basics. So last year we had the FFCRA, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, that required certain things of employers, cleaning, social distancing, mask wearing, in addition to having safety and operations policies, as well as emergency paid sick leave. Now, some things changed because at the end of the year, that actually expired at the federal level, but then the state enacted their own under the Healthy Families and Workplaces Act. So although we're looking at the public health emergency being ended here in Colorado back in July, what do employers need to know about emergency paid sick leave in this moment? Do they need to offer it? Can they not? Are they required? What are some of those legal risks that they need to consider?
Sure. And I think the perspective here, the Healthy Families Workplace Act that you mentioned, does take into account not just Colorado's view on whether or not a public health emergency exists, but the federal view as well. And so from the federal view, as of today, November 15th, it still exists. So as far as, even though Colorado made a declaration in the summer months, it's still in effect. And what that means is that emergency paid sick leave is still something that needs to be offered, considered, utilized. It's still alive and well here in Colorado. Okay,
that's really great to know. So employers, if you have employees that are sick with COVID, they get a positive test, they're told to quarantine at the discretion of a medical professional. It is in your best interest to continue paying for that leave. Now, the stipulation was that if you offer one paid leave up to 80 hours for your full-time employees, after that, you're kind of relieved of your requirement and your due diligence there as an employer after that point. So what do you see with employers? Is there a risk there if their employees get maybe sick several times or caregiver several times within the year as we get towards the end of the year?
Yeah, so the risk is not keeping track, or otherwise something happens where there's emergency paid sick leave taken, and it's taken from the employee's perspective or from the employer's perspective, but from the other perspective, it's not. So there's a misalignment of understanding as to what that particular leave counted as, and then something happens again. And so therefore, what are we to do? Because from someone's perspective, maybe the employer's perspective, your 80 hours is up. And from the employee's perspective, not so much. I didn't use the 80 hours that I thought I didn't or still had in the bank. So from that perspective, I think it's the miscommunication that is a big risk in terms of tracking. And it's an easily solved problem by maintaining the right records and maintaining, even in just payroll, this is what this particular leave counted as or didn't count as, and having that understanding as well between the employer and the employee. So the other big risk would be a change in the law, which it really can happen. I'm not necessarily aware. I've not been tracking what's going on in Denver and the bills getting passed through or being at least negotiated now or considered now. But there's always the possibility that instead of a one and done, we have our 80-hour bank and that's it. Conceivably, it gets either renewed or there's another extenuating circumstance, another COVID-related leave that in fact then entitles the person to another 80 hours. Now, that's not in place right now, but who knows? And that's one of the nuances here that we always have to be very cognizant of the changes in law or the coming changes in law and how that could be applied in the situation of work and leave.
Great points. Thank you, Chris. I know you and I had talked about some of the differences. I know a lot of employers are looking at, okay, the Healthy Families and Workplaces Act, paid sick time of 48 hours per employee throughout the year. And some of them haven't implemented that yet because as of January 1st, it's required of all Colorado employers with 16 or less employees, right? Right now, we're looking at 16 or more employees. The employers should have implemented that this year and been offering that. So if they have the paid sick time in a bucket, and that's the 48 hours, and then there's the emergency paid sick leave for COVID-related leave, do those things run concurrently or are they two separate? So your employee can maybe get 48 hours of sick time that is not related to COVID, maybe, although that is covered under the Healthy Families and Workplaces Act as the emergency paid sick leave under a public health emergency. As you said, at the federal level, we're still there. And get the 80 hours, up to 80 hours of the COVID leave, or how do those things work together and what's that risk there?
Yeah, so they are two separate buckets. I think I'd keep them in two separate buckets, even though there's overlap in one particular issue, and that's COVID. The paid sick leave can apply to a host of issues, including things like domestic violence, that just don't apply under the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act. So even though there is overlapping, you got to keep them separate, and that falls back to this communication again and record keeping, where this particular day of leave or week of leave is to be applied against this bank of hours, COVID or not, and just keeping that clear and making sure the employees are clear on that as well.
Okay, wonderful. And for those of you, if you have hopefully a payroll provider, they should be on top of that. There should be tracking capabilities. If you're using QuickBooks or something like that, that's already built in. That's been built in all year to help you track. And that's definitely something that you do want to track. Hours that are earned with the paid sick leave, hours that are taken with paid sick leave or emergency paid sick leave for COVID related reasons. Tracking is your friend. Document, document, document.
That's right. And even the accrual, I mean, one other difference would be just the accrual. And so an employer might have a policy of, hey, here's your 48 hours right at the beginning of the calendar year, which they have flexibility to do. Or they follow the statute in terms of for so many hours worked, then you get so many hours of paid sick leave. So even that, that little nuance there is different in between the two, but I just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a great point. And the accrual rate's been fun. It's 1 hour for every 30 hours worked. So you either have to front load it or stop it from accruing at some point in the year once they hit 48 hours, and they can use it as they accrue it, right? So that's been the tricky thing with a lot of payroll providers and a lot of small business owners that are trying to administer their own, is it's a little bit different it's not just 48 hours, it's meeting that minimum accrual rate. So what we've seen a lot of times is even employers that have currently offered PTO packages, the accrual rate doesn't always meet the minimum requirement by the state. So make sure that you guys review that, ensure that you're compliant there. If you have less than 16 employees, you need to be prepared for January 1st because this will become a requirement for you. Okay, next burning question. I know there's a lot of employers that are watching the mandate of requiring employers with over 100 employees mandating vaccinations among their employees. So in the small business community, it's not necessarily a mandate of them, if they're a requirement of them as an employer, but what do they need to consider if they don't have anything in place, if they don't have a policy, if they're really trying to evaluate, do I want to require vaccinations of my employees, or do I just want to strongly recommend it? What do employers need to evaluate as far as their risks there?
No, it's there's many different factors to consider, and really, I think fundamentally, you arrive at a point where there's a decision made, but once that decision is made, have clarity on it. So obviously, if there's no policy, let's say there's no vaccine requirement in your work site, that's fine. We're talking about, again, all disclaimers here. With 100 or less, things that may come. We're doing this recording right now. But the idea of, all right, that's the way we want to go. There's still OSHA related and health and safety related requirements that you need to follow. So, you may get the one uncomfortable situation, or conceivably an employee who's not comfortable with that workplace, but it's more than just discomfort. It's actually an issue regarding OSHA standards and between social distancing, between keeping some check in regards to, we're not giving hugs every day. We're not doing things that would subject employees or customers to unnecessary risk, which those types of OSHA related requirements are not necessarily being tested right now. And we'll get to this point, but what I mean are the health and safety aspects, which have always been in existence. It's just now we've layered on top of it the virus and the ideas around the virus as to keeping people relatively safe or relatively lower risk by having certain distances respected, or possibly masking in certain situations. So if you're not going to do it, so be it. But don't forget, there's health and safety requirements, both federally and at the state level, that still need to be followed up with, because just like that, you might find yourself in a situation that violates or possibly infringes on some requirements for keeping workers safe. So if you are going to do it, don't forget. But if you are going to do it, and what I mean is, you're going to have some vaccine mandate, you have the right to do that. And really the key is how are you going to implement it? How are you going to deal with requests for accommodations, whether it's a medical related accommodation or a religious based accommodation, which are really the two primary. And there's some other subcategories that can get factored in, which has to do with, well, the remote workplace, why is this so important? Or even saying, well, we have a certain staff that deals with customers every day, as opposed to we have, E-band or other corporate folks who are just in a different situation. And you can have two separate policies. That's not necessarily a wrong thing. In fact, OSHA addresses that in their most recent mandate, which is being challenged as we speak. But the idea being is that if you're going to have a vaccine policy, you need to have and really think about, before implementing it, what you're to do when someone requests the accommodation, the amount of questioning that you can have, some dialogue back and forth, some verification to some extent. And then at the end of the day, what is it that's going to be implemented that does not create that undue burden? Because we're still back, COVID or not, this is essentially an accommodation request. We have an employer requirement, which generally and needs to be followed, no doubt about it. But then we have this this difference of, well, it's COVID related and it's vaccine related, but it really still falls back to the accommodation, engagement process, undue burden. And so those three things still exist, and they're not lost on just because an accommodation is requested doesn't invariably mean it must be granted. There really should be the analysis from the employer to say, what can we do? And is this possible? And I can tell you that large employers have taken a different tact, like a United Airlines has taken a different tact compared to what you may be doing with a group of 5 or 10 employees. So just because, let's say, again, a large employer's looking at a vaccine mandate one way doesn't mean that you need to look at it the same way. And really the issue is resources, and resources that you have to dedicate to process, procedure, figuring things out. And let's not forget, what did you have on the books to begin with? So going into COVID, maybe there was some sort of reimbursement policy that you already had in place. And all of a sudden now COVID's changed that, and you just want to wipe the slate clean. Well, that might create an issue because it's kind of targeted, or it might be focused on this one or two employee who are requesting this accommodation, and you're trying to work with that undue burden. But what I'm saying is look at what you had in place first, and then try to bounce off of that what is being requested and really the undue burden to the business. And I know I'm kind of going off on a tangent, but the idea of you have two ways of dealing with this. I would say don't try to walk this balance beam of, well, in some cases we do, in some cases we don't, for the same types of employees. That's going to get you nowhere really fast. That's going to subject you to greater scrutiny. It's going to say, well, he or she can do it, but I can't. I mentioned, yes, executives in the ivory towers somewhere might be subject to a different policy. That's okay. But when we're talking about two comparable employees, you got to treat them similarly. So I'll quiet down.
No, thank you for your tangent, because I think those are really important things to look at, because right now employers are balancing all these things, right? What does the CDC say? What does OSHA say? What is my team saying? Like, maybe if I do require vaccinations or don't, I'm going to lose quite a few of them, and I can't afford that in my business. Maybe it's the kind of customers that we have coming. Maybe they're very public facing, and it's going to make an impact on the public. And no matter what decision you make, it's going to have an impact among your workforce and among your customers or whoever you're serving. So there's a lot to consider. There's the cultural, there's the public perception, but I think you make really, really great points is, sometimes it's okay, I've got to be able to work through these accommodations and these one-off requests. Is it doable? Will it create a hardship for my business? Because I think I see so many employers that go either way, of maybe bending over backwards and trying to do too much for every single individual person instead of having like more of a blanketed policy and trying to work within that. Or I see that they're very stringent and don't really want to give anything, but in some cases they have to. It's when we look at the Americans with Disabilities Act and some of the requirements there, you have to enter into the process, or really look at what accommodations can I make? Can we say, okay, maybe it's unvaccinated folks wear masks and vaccinated don't have to. Maybe it's some of my workforce can be remote, and that's going to balance things out. And maybe the people that really want to work remotely and they're empowered in their roles, maybe they can. So I think there's so many different aspects, and you bring really, really great points. And for small business owners, when you're making these decisions, I recommend looking through some of the FAQs that these entities have, because they have some really solid information. Chris provided a few from OSHA that I will actually list in the chat here. So you guys can have access to that, but the CDC has great information. The EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, has a great FAQ as far as the ADA process and religious accommodations. Those are wonderful resources. So we want to make sure to provide you some resources as well. But I recommend maybe writing out pros and cons, really trying to decide, what do I need in my policy? What are maybe some of the objections that I might get from my staff or my customers, and where is that middle ground that I have to be able to hold strong that makes sense for everybody, right? And just make a decision that makes sense for your business.
Yeah. And unfortunately, this time is kind of forcing small employers, which are, known to have great flexibility and, just not, eliminate the bureaucracy, right? But these types of, whether they're, mandates or recommendations or other things, are really forcing small employers to be more stringent and uncomfortably so, which I think a lot of the rub is. But it's a unique time, and it's just something that, as a business owner, focusing on the mission of the business, of, your success, and how you can continue to be successful, and not necessarily, making this as personal as it can be, but rather just sticking with the business decision. And as Leah was saying, taking that time out, and not just in an hour, but bouncing ideas off of whether it's resources like HR branches, whether it's other co-owners, and even if there's any sort of surveying that you can do, but just taking a more informed decision to come down to what is likely going to be a lot of the standard, which is reasonable. And so where it's gray in the law, and it really is gray right now, there's going to be questions on, was it reasonable? Did it make sense? Did it impose some sort of burden that was beyond $1 to the employer? Did it impose a burden on the employee that was beyond just, well, now I have to go to a testing site? There's going to be some testing here of what is reasonable, and really, common sense shouldn't be left at the door when making these decisions.
That's a great point, Chris. It's, and sometimes this is incredibly overwhelming. So I think there are so many resources available to the small business community. And, attorneys like you, Chris, to sit down and say, okay, let's look at your specific situation and what's going on, maybe some of the objections that you're seeing, or let's look at your risks, and then let's decide, okay, what is really the legal risk here? Or, what are you okay to do maybe in this scenario? Just to have that perspective, because I think sometimes it can be really easy to kind of spin the wheels and say, I just don't want to get sued. I don't want to get shut down by the health department. I want to do all these things, even if it's a significant financial impact to my business. What really does make sense? Like you said, what is reasonable? So I think that there's so many opportunities it's a complete relief to be able to run conversations and scenarios and things by you, right? Where we can put HR and attorneys together and say, okay, but let's really look at the situation and come up with maybe best case scenario, less risk, because there's always a risk associated. But just know that you guys have resources available to you.
Yep. And again, it's really difficult to answer questions in a vacuum, knowing the business, knowing how it's structured, knowing what precedent this is really going to set. Oh, it's only a 3-person operation, or it's a 50-person operation. It really does matter. And then also just thinking, again, just because one business is doing it, it should be taken into consideration, but not necessarily held as the gospel truth. Instead, it should just be looked at as, okay, that's what they're doing. And possibly, you never know. And again, I'm not going to pick on United Airlines, but they implemented something regarding using unpaid leave in response to these requests for accommodations. Southwest Airlines was going to follow that, but then about a month ago, they decided we're not going to do that. So same industry, very similar issues, but 2 fundamental points are being taken on the same kind of question. So, again, restaurant A and restaurant B don't necessarily mean that restaurant A does what restaurant B does, and vice versa.
Yeah, great point. You have to do what is great for your business and what makes sense and what's going to continue helping you to be successful, and not put yourself at risk and your business at risk of fines and penalties and lawsuits. So great points. So as we're talking about some fines and penalties, there's a lot of different entities that, and I think OSHA is the biggest one, but we're looking at, I just read about the Packers being fined $300,000 for not following COVID-19 protocols, and then Aaron Rodgers specifically getting fined about $15,000 for not following COVID protocols. So are you seeing kind of a range of fines and penalties outside of maybe lawsuits? I don't know if that's your area of expertise, if you've witnessed anything like that.
So I can only speak a little bit to it, but generally it is the governing authorities that have the ability. So like NFL, to me, the closest thing would be you have a franchise.
Mhm.
and that the franchise owner is deviating from the business HQ and what they've required, because they want to present a unified, this is how we present to our customers across the nation, and where you are doesn't matter, this is what we want. So that would be the closest thing where there would be some sort of penalty from like a franchise or to a franchisee of you didn't follow our protocol, and that would be the closest to like an Aaron Rodgers or that. But otherwise, it would be a federal. I'm not quite as aware of the state in terms of enforcement. They're certainly out. They're certainly there, but federal OSHA has taken a big lead on this. And reflecting on my time in California, practicing employment law there and keeping up with it as well, I still practice there. It's the enforcement arm statewide is night and day different from the enforcement arm in Colorado. Doesn't mean that Colorado is not there, but it's just different. So looking at that and just kind of keeping in mind that whether it is, all right, are we reporting when we have 5 or more, this outbreak threshold? Super important. The county, that's on the county level. Are we following those guidelines? And then walking that back, what we originally talked about in the beginning of this was, we just very, very tangentially touched it. Is this business and how they're doing things generally and as best as it can, following the requirements for just health and safety in the era of COVID? That comes from not just the feds, but also the state. So in terms of penalties, I've not been witness to or had to deal with too many levies, but to me, it's always there, and it's not like it's a sleeper. It's there. It's just the amount of resources that either the feds or the state can commit to enforcing and possibly making an example of a small business, in light of here's how this was run, and we find this totally against what we've issued. Therefore, we're going to go with a heavy hand and make sure the other businesses pay attention. So just always be aware of that.
Yeah, that's really the biggest risk, right? If you're the one, and right now a lot of small businesses are still recovering from last year. They're still applying for grants and loans and trying to get back to successful if they were significantly impacted. So any fines and penalties, any lawsuit, attorney fees, even if you win, that risk. The financial burden is still going to be there. So
it's a costly win. And I don't know if anyone gets great joy or excitement over paying attorneys like myself, just to vindicate. Obviously, there's something that comes from that, but boy, it distracts from your business. It distracts from your mission. It distracts from the vacation you wanted to take. It just distracts. And, that's one of the worst things for a business, is to distract. You want to eliminate distractions. You want to focus on what you do really, really well and what you make money on.
Yeah, great point. Great point. So can I ask maybe your perspective of where you see future legislation going, and some of these restrictions that employers are now seeing, especially in the small business community? Do you see this becoming more restrictive, or is this potentially going to loosen up a little bit? What's kind of your perspective?
Yeah, and I hate to say this because I am more negative in this way, at least from the employer's perspective, to say what typically takes form or shape in California or in other jurisdictions like Illinois or New York. They're crafting laws, and they're crafting a lot of ways to confer more authority to governing bodies. That slowly but surely, in some way, shape, or form, makes its way, and in California, it makes its way east. So in that perspective, what I've seen happen here, I feel like it's likely, if I had to put money on this, it's likely going to become either more restrictive, or it's going to take a form that is less familiar. And that less familiar is either there's more enforcement, there's more power. You didn't see necessarily something coming. So from that look, I would see COVID's not quite going away. I mean, I cross my fingers every day saying, why is Colorado right now in the state it's in? Why is El Paso County specifically in the state it's in? But either way, it gives that momentum and it gives that reason to potentially enact more and to solidify more. And of course, we'll get either to this or that idea that OSHA, this federal body, can issue this mandate. And granted, there's a threshold right now. Maybe it's 100 employers and defense contractors and things like that. But what's to say it shouldn't be 50 employees? What's to say it shouldn't be 25 employees? A lot of, reflecting on this, a lot of the laws in effect, the civil rights in the workplace, a lot of them originally had thresholds on the number of employees. Even California had thresholds on the number of employees, and same thing with state level and like FMLA type legislation that, at a certain point we say the employer can only handle so much. Maybe it's 50 employees, maybe it's 25. And it continually goes down and gets chopped down to, we just need one. We just need one employee and that's enough. And so here we are. And so this seems to be the way things are going. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way, but if it continues down this path, I would see just additional regulation, additional monitoring, and it's going to probably come from more executive type authorities such as OSHA, where it's not necessarily coming through the legislature, but it's through these bodies that are empowered to then enforce health and safety, or enforce, we're all familiar with workplace, not just regulations, but wages and the entities that do that on behalf of the government. So I see from the administrative side more. And the OSHA mandate, that emergency requirement that's being tested right now in the Fifth Circuit and all these things that are going on, that is a great example of what is and what are the limits of an executive agency in mandating, requiring, and enforcing a requirement and mandate that is as broad sweeping as that is. So we'll see where it goes, but I'm of the mindset it's probably going to be more restrictive in the future.
That makes sense. We've been watching a lot of the legislation, especially over the last year, that's kind of rained down on the small business community, right? As they were trying to get through COVID and then trying to recover from COVID. And, we saw things like the Healthy Families and Workplaces Act requiring paid sick time because only 60% of the workforce in Colorado had access to any PTO, which, right, forces them to come to work sick, puts everyone at risk, and it just creates a big problem. But now we're seeing, right, the paid FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act, has actually been passed quite a while ago, but has not been implemented yet. But that will impact the small business community. And right now they're looking at 2024. And then we're also looking at the retirement savings. That is now going to be a requirement of small businesses. That was supposed to be enforced already, but they're trying to figure out what that even looks like. So we're looking at next year. So I completely agree. We are seeing a lot of that now coming down to small businesses, to those groups of one or more employees, or maybe it's 15, maybe it's 50, but we are seeing a lot more requirements, and it's going to be a larger price point, a larger line item to hire an employee, which does create an impact. But it's definitely something to budget and plan for now, instead of waiting for it to be implemented and then figure out what the heck am I going to do, right?
Yeah, and it's a great point. And I mean, I'm not even going to begin on there's so many considerations for small business and what they offer, what they don't. And, there generally speaking should be flexibility to some degree. And it's exactly that, where in this situation, we have no prior PTO or no other availability. And so therefore, with all the best of intentions, the idea is, well, let's provide through the government mandated leave. because it's not being provided everywhere. And we want to do this, again, best of intentions, to keep unhealthy people away from the workplace, but not jeopardize their job, not jeopardize their livelihood. So again, we've got great intentions here. And unfortunately, it starts to snowball. And here we are, and we're likely looking at additional regulations, considerations, and the ones you hit on are spot on. We're talking about, well, how does the employer factor into retirement? And if it doesn't, then the government has some mandate or at least some system to provide. Okay, and then how about paid family leave and things of that way? And I can tell you, just look west, see what California has, and there's the crystal ball. In some way, maybe not the all of their laws, but maybe some or some piece of it. That's the model. It really is the model that's being utilized.
Yeah, we had Katie Wedland in here from Human Interest, and they manage 401ks and IRA plans for small businesses. And she nailed it. She said that Colorado is California's annoying little brother.
Yeah.
We're looking up and saying, what are you doing? I want to do the same thing. So that makes total sense.
And it makes total sense. And, possibly it's just slower here because of a variety of political reasons. It's definitely a different makeup here. But the idea is just at some point in time, there's testing going on in, let's say, California. And sometimes things are very successful and sometimes things are not. But either way, it's there for the taking or the borrowing or the replicating here.
Yeah, great perspective. So let's do a little bit of a wrap up for everyone. That was a lot of information. Some of it may be new to you. So I'd say my top list is make sure that you have your employment posters posted. That's the very least thing you can do to prevent your risk of, fines and penalties there. That has to be posted in a conspicuous place, well seen by employees, and in a common area. So I know that they're not super pretty. You can order the laminated ones, but at the very least, those need to be posted. There's so many that I walk into an employment workplace and they're just not there. Then make sure that you create your COVID safety and vaccination policies. Really drill down and figure out, what does this need to look like? Like Chris has said, you really need to pick a side just to see what that looks like, and then be consistent in your application. That's the most important thing, is to administer it. What you do for one, you do for all, outside of those accommodation scenarios. Okay. But it needs to be consistently practiced. And then minimizing your risk by following, the CDC and the OSHA guidelines at the very least, to make sure that you as an employer are providing a safe and healthy workplace, because that is a responsibility and a requirement of you. It can get you in hot water if you don't. And then last but not least, if you are not Healthy Families and Workplaces compliant with your PTO policy, make sure that you get on top of that ASAP. That needs to be implemented immediately if you have more than 16 employees, or by January 1st if you have less. But one or more, you're going to need to have that here in just a couple months. So make sure that you're prepared there. Chris, do you have like a top 3 for employers that they really need to focus on right now?
Yeah, I would just budget. When you talk to an attorney, it's sometimes way too late. Occasionally you can triage a situation, but you do want to at least get to know, and just this is a plug. I mean, it really be like for HR branches to say, get the relationship established, get HR branches, an entity like that, to know your business, to know how you operate, to really review and understand and respond to questions. Because again, it's a much cheaper alternative, number one, but it's a much better and informed alternative, because answering questions in a vacuum for me comes with so many qualified responses, because I either don't know your business or I don't know what the situation well enough, that everything is, well, I need to tap dance a bit, because I just am not that comfortable until I know. And then I know, by the time I know, it's either too late or we don't have that much time. So getting with some consultant, I see this the same as you have a CPA, you go to the dentist, you don't do your own dentistry, things of that nature. It's it's worth the investment to get a firm like HR Branches on your side. And then, if push comes to shove, then of course, the attorneys are always there. They're always ready, willing, and able to help. But you just don't want to deal with us. You really don't. So that's number one. Number two, going back to health and safety, yes, those requirements are not being questioned right now. The issue right now in the courts has to do with whether or not this mandate of vaccines for certain employers is legitimate or not. But when it comes to health and safety in the workplaces, that's really, the rules and regulations, those are not being questioned. So between, yes, posters, and I've represented employers that failed to have their posters, and it was a quick picture, and that was a quick fine. It wasn't much of anything. And it's really frustrating. But besides that, just stay on top of it. Unfortunately, that's one of the requirements that's imposed on you as a business owner. And then, I think finally is use common sense in whether it's developing a policy or just figuring out a certain situation. Don't let ego, frustration, a like or a dislike of an employee guide your decisions. Always reflect on how this is going to impact the business, how this is going to impact our mission, and what precedent it sets within the business, because when it's not, it becomes this one-off, and one-offs are usually what get tested in the courts. So that would be my top three right off the cuff.
Awesome. Great points. Great feedback. So again, Chris, thank you so much for sitting down and having this conversation with me. You were more than willing. I didn't have to convince you at all. You were like, no, I'm there. Let's do this, to really, talk about these things to help the small business community. And I really like to put our brains together and give these different perspectives, right, of the same thing. And just to answer some of these burning questions that employers are still struggling with. We know you are out there in the small business community just wondering what the heck you should do. Some of it is so gray, and you may have a little bit of, analysis paralysis. So what I say is the best thing you can do is take that first step forward and just establish something, some kind of guidance or guideline to reduce your risk there. That's the first step. And just take it as it comes. But, Chris made a great point. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We want to help you prevent, having to call Chris because now you're in litigation. So thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate your participation in this conversation and your perspective. It's been absolutely wonderful. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope this was helpful. And for our HR members, this will be in the training vault available to you to view later. If you know anyone that needs help or wants to view this video, send them our information and we will get them hooked up. All right, guys, thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. Thank you so much, Chris.
You're welcome.